Good morning. Welcome all of you. It's time to start our webinar. Welcome all of you in this electronic webinar regarding the sexual harassment within the sectors and also the challenges to addressing this problem. This is supported by the Resource and Support Hub. I will be the facilitator for the sessions. I'll introduce myself. My name is Layth Al Sayed Ahmed. I'm the national representative in the Resource and Support Hub in Syria. I working in the Syrian crisis response within 7 years by designing some humanitarian programs, and also I'm doing follow-up and researches in Syria. For the first time people joining this webinar, we are focused as a resource and support hub in different aspects regarding the protections like the sexual exploitations and also the assault and also the sexual harassments, and also by working in different national centers and in the regions. Always we highlight the sexual harassments because it has its own challenges, and sometimes it's very difficult to challenges and tackling it within the area of the assistance. So today we are making this session regarding the sexual harassments. We are going to give like an overview about the history of the sexual harassments within the area of the assistance, and we looking that you have a good understanding about the moments and also the incidents of the sexual harassments and why we should give more attention, and also the challenges that some organizations faced when tackling this problem. Today, we are going to give our opinions in Syria by giving like an overview about the history within the Syrian context, and also to give a briefing about the some initiatives that we did regarding tackling the sexual harassments within the area of assistance. For that, we invited two speakers. They are going to give like presentations during this webinar. I'd like to welcome all of them and also to introduce them. The first speaker, she's Claudia. Claudia, she is a consultant for the protections, and she worked for more than 12 years. She has 12 years experience in this field, and she worked in our different various working group and to tackling and addressing the sexual problems. She is well-trained investigator in this field, and now she is also joining at training from the CHS to build professional skills regarding the investigations in this field, and also the today, Claudia, she will give presentations regarding the health and the safety in the assistance program, and also in a different area, and how, and also the laws, and also the conventions and the agreements, national agreements and international agreements. And Kinda Horani, she will be the second speaker. She is the program manager for SEMA, which is a Syrian organization. She worked in this field in the last 10 years, and she's a member of the Turkish protection centers and other also committees, GPS, CB, and other. Here, she is also a member of the Syrian Resource and Support Hub. During her presentation, Kinda, she is going to focus about the sexual harassment, specifically inside the area of assistance, and what's the definitions, and also what's the initiatives, and also the efforts to tackling these problems, and also what's the challenges faced these organizations. Before we start, I'd like to share with you some admin points regarding these sessions. In the beginning, all of you, as you notice, you are in silent mode, and also we stop your cameras This we do it to ensure the best quality for the webinar. We are going to record this webinar and also to share it in our web site, and you can reach it for anybody who cannot join us today. He can listen. Your names, it will not be shown. This webinar, it will be in the Arabic language. It will be the main language to accept the presentation of Claudia. It will be done in English. Also, I'd like to say that we are going to give simultaneous interpretation for English and Arabic as well. So to go to the interpretation to choose the language, you can go here to the translation or to the interpretations. You can push Arabic or English to choose the appropriate language that you need to listen, and then you can make a mute for your sound, so you cannot hear your sound, and there will be an overlapping for the sound. We are going to have like a questions and answer. We are going to give like a time by the end of the webinar for the questions and the answers. In case you need, for example, to ask any questions during the this webinar, you can add your questions, for example, in the Q&A part or in the chat box, and you can uh, add any questions you need to add it. My colleagues, they are going to answer it, and we are going to select some questions and answer to this to give it to the speakers to have an answers for these questions. After this long, I'd like to present Claudia. Claudia, first, thank you for joining us today. In the beginning, what are the sexual harassments and what is the definitions for sexual harassments?
Thank you so much, Leif, for your kind introduction. And before you enter, welcome to everybody. It's really a huge pleasure to spend the next hour with all of you. And it's also nice to see the big interest. I can see we have more than 100 participants. Yes, Leif. So what I'm going to do before I go into your question, I wanted to share with you a short overview on what we are going to talk about in the next 20 minutes. So what we are talking about, and of course we can't go into really depth because we just have the 20 minutes, but we will tackle what is sexual harassment. So this is also regarding the question Leif just asked. Then we will look at sexual exploitation and abuse, the so-called SEA, and sexual harassment, SH, and why there is this separation. We will talk about sexual harassment and international standards or statements of law as a starting point in drafting legislation that prohibits sexual harassment. We will look shortly at the root causes and also at the consequences, and then we wrap up. So now I get to you, Leif, and your question. So before we go into any definition, next slide, please. I wanted to share with you some overall conceptual points of sexual harassment. So sexual harassment is, as you can see on the slide, a serious manifestation of sex discrimination and a violation of human rights. And that's really, really important. It's a manifestation of sex discrimination. Sexual harassment can be perpetrated against both women and men, and of course also non-binary gender. However, the majority of cases that we see worldwide in the workplace primarily are perpetrated by men against women. And sexual harassment is not simply about the misbehavior of a few misguided or malicious individuals, which sometimes the public thinks. It is it's very widespread, which is shown in the prevalence and persistence of sexual harassment. As you can see, in the European Union countries, between 40 and 50% of women experience unwanted sexual advances, physical contact, and other forms of sexual harassment at work annually. In the United States, and that's an alarming number, 83% of girls aged between 12 and 16 experience some form of sexual harassment in public schools. And also across Asia, many studies have shown that around 30 to 40% of women suffer from workplace harassment. I left out Syria because Kinda is going to talk about this in her presentation. Okay, so we are coming to some of the definitions. Next slide, please. So I have chosen 3 definitions, and I wanted to start because we are participating in a webinar of Safeguarding Resource Hub. So I decided I start with this definition. So here, sexual harassment is understood as a continuum of unacceptable and unwelcome behaviors and practices of a sexual nature that may include, but are not limited to, sexual suggestions or demands, requests for sexual favors, and sexual verbal or physical conduct or gestures that are or might reasonably be perceived as offensive or humiliating. Important here, if you look at it, is the continuum. It's unacceptable and it's unwelcome behavior as of sexual nature, and it's perceived by the recipient as offensive and humiliating. Yeah, so that's the key here in this definition. If we move to the next slide, I decided to also show you a definition of the International Labour Organizations. And of course, sexual harassment here in this definition is in regards to sexual harassment at workplace. So they differentiate a bit between the so-called quid pro quo, which comes from Latin and means this for that. And here it says any physical, verbal or non-verbal conduct of a sexual nature and other conduct based on sex affecting the dignity of women and men, and of course also non-binary gender, which is unwelcome, unreasonable, and offensive to the recipient, and a person's rejection, and that's now important, of or submission to such conduct is used explicitly or implicitly as a basis for a decision which affects the person's job. Yeah, so again, what we see here, also similarities with the Safeguarding Resource Hub definition. It's affecting the dignity, it's unwelcome, it's unreasonable, and it's perceived as offensive. The second part is the conduct that creates an intimidating, hostile, or humiliating work environment for the recipient. If we move to the next slide, I also decided to use the definition that I guess many of you know from the toolkit that was developed for Syria from the Center for Transnational Development and Collaboration and Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And I'm not sure if some of you are also here from those 2 organizations. And there it says, sexual harassment is any abusive and unwanted practice, action, or behavior of a sexual nature to which a person or group of persons is exposed directly or indirectly. And this can include non-physical, sexual, and or verbal behaviors that cannot be classified as assault. And that's the difference here. If we look at the previous 2 definitions, here we have a definition where it clearly says anything that cannot be classified as sexual assault is considered sexual harassment. Yeah. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Claudia. Indeed, there seems to be a lot of similar but differing definitions on how sexual harassment is defined. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, it seems that there's a lot of commonalities between these different definitions, but I guess the way it manifests is also part of the problem, why mm-hmm. nobody can agree but what constitutes sexual harassment and what doesn't. So thank you very much for that. I guess it would be great if you could walk us through some of the different forms that, through which sexual harassment can manifest, or the different forms that it can take.
Yeah, with pleasure. So we go to the next slide. And here I use certain forms of sexual harassment, also particular at workplace. And you will see I was using those forms based on some of the international definitions. So when we come to the forms of sexual harassment, you differentiate between 3 forms. It's physical forms. such as any unwanted contact ranging from intentionally touching, caressing, pinching, hugging, or kissing to, and now that's the difference to the toolkit definition, it would also go up to sexual assault or rape. Verbal forms of sexual harassment include socially and culturally inappropriate and unwelcome comments with sexual overtones, such as sexually suggested jokes or comments about a person's dress, body, the looks of someone, made in their presence or directed towards them. And this can also, and that's really important now also, they can include persistent proposals and unwelcome requests or persistent personal invitations to go out. And it happens a lot. And then there is the third one, which is the non-verbal forms, which are often very difficult to identify, of sexual harassment, which include unwelcome gestures, suggestive body language, which in an international setting is also often tricky because we all come from different cultural backgrounds. Indecent exposure, certain ways of looking at someone, repeated winks or gestures with fingers, and it also includes the unwelcome display of pornographic material, sexually explicit pictures or objects, screensavers on your computers, for example, posters in offices, as well as sexually explicit emails, notes, WhatsApp messages, text messages. So everything that happens online is becoming more and more and more crucial in this regard. Next slide, please. So I hope, Leif, I could answer the forms a bit. So I will continue now with the second part or the second topic of the presentation, which I think is interesting for most of you as well. So why this separation? So we often see the abbreviation SEA, we see the abbreviation PSEA, we see the abbreviation SH, and it's all very confusing for most of us. And I decided to show you this slide because the separation is basically coming, and this is not to blame anyone, but it's coming a bit from the United Nations, and there's a reason also. If you look at this table, and it's actually a table from the United Nations, you can see, if you look at the first row only, the so-called WHO row, you can see that sexual exploitation and sexual abuse, you know, this package, I call it package, the SEA package, is something that is a misbehavior that is conducted by, let's say, part of the by staff of the UN or the associated partner staff towards external stakeholders and primarily the beneficiaries. So it's a misconduct that is happening from staff members, including the partner staff, towards beneficiaries, while sexual harassment is something that the UN considers it's a misbehavior based on sexual nature that happens in between their staff members. And this also includes, again, the associated partner staff. So it's really, the differentiation is more of a structural nature, which doesn't mean, and I think that's often what confuses people, and which I learned from many workshops I have done. There's often the question, so beneficiaries cannot be sexually harassed. Yes, they can. But the UN defines it because of structural reasons. They separate it because when you investigate complaints, let's say from sexual exploitation and abuse, there's a certain department within the United Nations that is doing this, while sexual harassment cases within their own workforce is investigated by a different unit. And that's why they separate it. But as you can see, if we go into the table and we look at sexual harassment, you can see on the bottom that it includes touching, kissing, or speaking inappropriately to a colleague at work. And it's also the attempted or actual sexual assault, including rape and attempted rape. And I think that's what is confusing many, because you wouldn't necessarily think of sexual harassment and would include rape. what happens at the United Nations, they do have separate reports on those incidents. And of course, internally, if they investigate sexual harassment cases and it turns out to be a rape, they would also call it rape, but it would still be under the umbrella term of sexual harassment. So next slide, please. I wanted to show you also an approach that shows that even within the United Nations, there is a debate on this, because there, of course, there are many voices who also say, why this separation? We should do it on a more holistic approach. The root causes of all these misconduct are similar. They are rooted in power imbalances, and there's an initiative that was created that I wanted to present to you is the Interagency Standing Committee Championship Strategy, which was developed in 2018. And as you can see, it promotes a vision where people caught up in crisis feel safe and respected and can access the protection and assistance they need without fear of, and now, exploitation, abuse, or harassment. So here it's included, yeah, in regards to beneficiaries, by any aid worker, and in which aid workers themselves feel supported, respected, and empowered to deliver such assistance in working environments free from sexual harassment. So it's basically the first time that in 2018, those two, let's say, packages were mentioned in one vision together, and it shows that they are linked to each other. Next slide, please. I also wanted to present you, and I hope we are not rushing through it too much. I wanted to present you some international statements of law as a starting point in drafting the legislation that prohibits sexual harassment. And first of all, it's the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women from 1979. I think most of you are familiar with it. So there are general recommendations that include sexual harassment. There's even an article that defines sexual harassment. So you can see that already in the 70s and then also in the 90s, people were already talking about sexual harassment. I also wanted to show you the International Labour Organization's Convention, which was developed in 2019, so relatively recently. It's the so-called the Violence and Harassment Convention, the number 190, and its accompanying recommendations. And I can really recommend you reading it because it's quite comprehensive, and some countries have already ratified it, and more will come, and it's probably the basis for a lot of national legislation when it comes to labor law and prohibiting sexual harassment. Yeah, so it's really good to go through and read it. Next slide, please. And there's also, of course, a lot of things are going on within the EU, within the Charter of Fundamental Rights and the European Union, and it's important there that the European Union also defines harassment and sexual harassment as a discrimination on grounds of sex, which is really, really important. We also have the Istanbul Convention from 2011, which I guess also most of you know, which also talks about discrimination and sexual harassment. And there's much more. There's a lot of conventions and regulations in the African continent, and also Kinda will talk you through some of Middle East. So I have left this out on purpose here. Next slide, please. So what are the root causes of sexual harassment and its consequences? And again, we can't go into a lot of depth. It would require a proper or unique webinar just on talking about root causes, but I wanted to show you at least some. So it's very important to understand sexual harassment as a matter of sex and gender inequalities, of power that intersect with other dimensions of inequalities, including race and ethnicity, age, disability, sexual orientation, economic status. So it's really important. And I know the Safeguarding Resource Hub is promoting an intersectional approach to safeguarding, but it's really, really crucial to also apply this to sexual harassment, because otherwise you can't tackle the root causes, because there are many women and of course also men that are more likely to be a survivor of sexual harassment because of other forms of discrimination. Sexual harassment is systematic and structural. It is linked to broader social, economic, and political distributions of power that vest authority, decision-making, and belief in man. So it's really pervasive, and it's a social problem. Sexual harassment is often, and that's also really crucial to understand, is very often less about sexual interest and more about reinforcing existing power relations. Traditional gender roles and stereotypes of how women and men should act are replicated in the world of work. For example, when women are seen as breaking these roles by, let's say, working outside the home or entering a traditional male-dominated occupation, sexual harassment is often used as a form of punishment. And that's also important to understand. The next slide, please. And there are huge consequences, and this table only shows a few. But what is important to see, there are devastating consequences for the survivors. And I have investigated myself quite a lot of cases on sexual harassment, and I can tell you the consequences are devastating. So there's a lot of psychological suffering, there's humiliation, there's lack of motivation, there is behavior change, and I have seen this in women myself. There's a lot of isolation. There's women deciding to not enter the work market anymore, so they stay out, and there's up to suicide. The consequences can go up to suicide, which is really, really important to understand how devastating it can be. There's a lot of consequences, of course, for employers and for us as international organizations, national organizations, for the United Nations, private companies, of course, as well, in demotivation, in reputational loss, in a lot of money they have to invest, vacancies that they can't fill, because it's known that in this particular organization, harassment is normalized, maybe. And there are also a lot of consequences for the society as such. Yeah, there are long-term rehabilitation costs for the reintegration of survivors, unemployment, welfare benefits, individual costs, of course, legal and criminal costs, and women are undermined access to a higher status of well-paid jobs. So on the next slide, it's really important to see that sexual harassment results in large monetary costs for government and employers, particularly in terms of medical care and counseling. For employers, sexual harassment can also lead to significant reputational costs, increases and creates significant health, economic, and career costs for survivors. It also increases the already existing gender gap in the world of work, including the pay gap and the gap in labor force participation of women, and to the segregation of women into sectors and occupation with lower remuneration, or that have less limited career prospects. And also I added this, sexual harassment may be more present in highly feminized sectors where the majority of the production workforce is actually female, but the line supervisors and managers are men. And in this context, the fear or the reality of being sexually harassed may keep women from entering certain sectors. And that's really a shame. And that's why I wanted to mention this. The next slide, please. So some key messages to round it up. I know it's a lot to absorb, but sexual harassment can take many forms. I think that's something we learned, from really inappropriate jokes up to rape. It constitutes an act of misconduct, and every organization should take action to prevent sexual harassment. It can occur inside and outside the workplace and working hours. And that's also important, because sometimes people think, if I'm leaving my office, I can do whatever I want because I'm private. No, you're not. And it can be perpetrated by or targeted by any colleague of any status, of any gender. Yeah, so we need to also stop the impunity. That's really important. And the UN and also many organizations are focusing now on a victim-centered approach, which is important, but I still wanted to say that it's also, we have to be careful to not further victimize survivors by still also in our victim-centered approaches using stereotypes in terms of the assistance, because each individual is different and requires different assistance. Next slide, please. So sexual harassment is still widely tolerated in the world of work, and it really requires deeper social change. To address sexual harassment as a form of gender-based violence, it is necessary to really tackle its underlying causes and risk factors. This includes gender stereotypes, multiple and intersecting forms of discrimination, and unequal gender-based power relations. And this is for all: exploitation, abuse, and harassment. And as I said, there's a huge connection between sexual harassment and sexual exploitation and abuse. It's the abuse of power. And it's a workplace culture and an organizational and humanitarian system structural problem that we all have to work on. And it requires structural sensitivity and an alignment, and that's my personal point of view, of prevention of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment, with the commitments also of localization and to promote co-leadership. So what we are doing here right now, to really sit together and don't always, follow the international community and their definitions, but really sit together and talk about the problems, because otherwise we won't tackle it. Thank you so much. I hope I stayed my 20 minutes and I didn't rush through too much. And I hand over to Leif. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for the comprehensive and rich presentation. Just as a reminder for our audience today, please feel free to leave any questions you may have for Claudia or Kinda, or the Resource and Support Hub in the chat box below or in the Q&A section below, please. We will now be switching back to Arabic for the second section of the webinar led by Kinda. So please adjust your language settings accordingly.
Claudia, thank you for your presentation. I'd like to remind you again, in case you have any questions regarding what is presented by Claudia, you can use the chat or the questions and answers. It's a pleasure for me to introduce my second speaker, Kinda Al-Horani. She's the one to talk about the Syrian aspect regarding this subjects. Kinda, welcome you today. In the beginning, can you give us like just a brief about, for example, about the sexual harassments in the Syrian context, and also what's the initiatives that you did? I'll start from the our protections in Syria. First, we start our journey after Oxfam story that because a lot of international organizations they built our capacity to for the sexual harassments regarding the humanitarian interference, and also they built us and also built our policies, but regarding the sexual harassments, nobody pay more attention to that. After that, we initiated our organizations in Syria. It was good BCA to prevent the sexual harassments, and also the Syrian organizations they share, and we have training materials and videos, and but unfortunately we couldn't address the sexual harassments in the workplace. But finally, because of the Women Advisory Board, and I'm a member of that, we add the H to SIA, which is the sexual harassments, but we didn't discuss it with the Syrians or with the organizations, but we added just to the code of conduct to try to address this problem. I'd like to, in my briefing, to share my experience regarding the addressing the sexual harassments in the workspace, and we have the initiative in Syria. This initiative, it is uh, some youth people they study in the universities, and one of their discussions they noticed that the sexual harassment is based on the gender type, and so and nobody give it the appropriate attentions. So also we have the problem that it is based on the social problems, and also we give some trainings, and also we have documentations for these cases, and we give like psychological support by documentation for these cases. We find a lot of cases for refugees in Syria and in Turkey, and inside Syria the violence, it was based on the gender and also the social status. So we work on that. We work with all the institutions work in Turkey. In Turkey, we did like a workshop for 5 days. We have representatives from 11 organizations, women and men share in that, and we have a brainstorm and we discuss the experience of those people, and we agree to have like uh, definitions for the sexual harassments in Syria, which is, for example, the non-welcome approach, that is not welcoming, for example, that it is against the dignity of the people, and this is it depends on. So all the people they say that all organizations they should do their own dialogue. So to have like a culture in all organizations to fight the sexual harassments. For example, as Claudia mentioned, in like for example, sending like some sexual images, for example, or emails, for example, or make like some comments, or for example, or jokes, or sometimes to talk in somebody in inappropriate way, for example, or sometimes to ask a question that it's against the privacy of the persons, or sometimes to ask like for sexual favor, sometimes because to give a promotion for the person, or sometimes to threat some people to let him leave the work, or to give like sexual service. And after we done of these discussions, we did our champion. And our champions, we call it it's the safe champion. It is like by giving some brochures and animations, videos that we develop, and talk about some scenarios of the sexual harassments in the workspace, and how we can deal with it, and how you can behave. And all we share it in our sites for the 11 organizations, and by the end all the participants they give like a message for all the rescued victims that they experience sexual harassments in their workspace, that we have initiatives, and how you can do reporting, and we open like channels for the people that they can resort to these channels to get help as a victims. After that, we did our the first conference for the sexual harassments in the workspace, and like this day, it was in the year 2021, and we address the this problem in that conference, and we invite a lot of people from the higher positions, and from different organizations, because they were committed to share in this conference. The outcome of this conference, which was important, the first outcome, that all these Syrian organizations, they admit that we have sexual harassments in the workspace. And for me, it was very important, because in the discussions of this conference, some of these organizations, they deny that this is not within our culture and within our ethics. And after a lot of discussions, yes, they admit that yes, it has negative impacts on the person and his family, and also in the economical situations, and also it is degraded the status of different organizations. All the organizations in Syria, they said that we shouldn't tolerate in the sexual harassments, and also we should also make awareness workshop regarding sexual harassments, and also to have like a dialogue between different organizations, and also to promote for sexual awareness programs, and also to develop a mechanism, for example, for reporting, and also to have like observations and accountability mechanism, and also to look for all the complaints that we receive. These some of the outcomes that we receive, and it's adopted by the organizations, and they sign on it formally during the first Syrian conference against sexual harassments. This is also the we have, and one of the outcomes that we have three committees. With the first committee, it's reporting, and we have the other. I was one of the one working in the accountability committee, and we have also the awareness community. Three committees: reporting, awareness, and accountability. So all the people, they work in the organizations from the base until the higher of position. They will share how and they know how to receive the complaints, and who is responsible, for example, to investigate in the complaints, and what are the mechanisms, for example, to take the final decisions to ensure the transparency and accountability. And this is maybe the most important outcomes in our conference, and it was good. And because we did it in Syria, and we did it in deep discussions between us as Syrians. Thank you, Kenda. And we noticed that in our work, and maybe we can ensure that there were a lot of efforts, for example, to deal with this issue. But unfortunately, we still have a gap to deal with sexual harassments. And until now, there is a lot of challenges facing all the organizations regarding this issue. So, what are the most challenges that the Syrian organization faced? As we said, Mr. Laith, first, what I noticed that until now we have a lot of organizations that deny that we have this sexual harassments in the organizations, and they insist that our ethics and our traditions cannot allow things to happen. But even though we have these cases, and this reflect in the policies inside these organizations, and also in the response to these cases, and also the way they deal with the reporting, and also with the victims in case they receive some states. The gap is still in Syria, because we have a gap administratively, and also legal gap, and we know the problems that it happened in Syria, and we are working within the absence of the legal issue. We have a lot of victims. They prefer not to report and not to complain, because nobody will support them. Regarding the Syria and our office in Turkey, we have also legal issues, and they are not giving us a work permit to work there. And this is a lot of victims, they don't know to whom they can resort, for example, to complain, because they are not registered there in the Turkish government to have their rights. A lot of the problems also that the reporting mechanism, it will not guarantee the secrecy of reporting, and also we have most of the organizations there, they are very weak in regarding the investigations of these cases, and Also, for example, when one of the ladies, for example, complain, everyone will talk about her story, and things will be in the market, as we said. And some people they're afraid from revenge also, so they don't report. Some people they didn't get their job vacancy because they report about, for example, sexual harassment that they experience in one of the organization. I thank you, and I thank, for example, for the time that you give to me and to give you my experience. Thank you very much. Thank you, Kinda, for your representations. It was a good presentation, and it was very important with good details about the efforts that you did in the Syrian area regarding the sexual harassment. Normally, this time we just put it for the questions and the answers, but I noticed most of the questions that is already answered from my colleagues. So I'd like to give the questions for Claudia. Uh, Claudia, what are the most challenges that it face the organizations in the area, especially regarding, for example, the challenge of sexual harassment, how to deal with it as a problem?
Yes, thank you, Leith. I think Kinda mentioned already quite a lot of challenges, which she mentioned for Syria, which I can agree. It's also globally the same challenges. So I would say a big challenge for sexual harassment is that it's very often normalized. And I think that's a huge problem. And there's a lack of awareness about what constitutes sexual harassment. What is it actually? In particular, if it comes to all the non-verbal, it's very hard to tackle for some people. And there is a lot of fear among survivors of sexual harassment that I can say from the investigations I have done. A lot of fear of reprisal, a lot of fear losing the job, a lot of fear also receiving very negative consequences on behalf of the family, because sometimes it's maybe the only women that goes to work and earns money. So losing the job would mean that the whole family loses an income. So it's very, very highly underreported. And another thing that also Kinda mentioned in regards to investigation is often the lack of evidence, because sexual harassment, as often any other sexual misconduct, happens without witnesses. And it's, as we said, or as we saw in the definitions, it's a continuation often of certain behaviors. And I can say personally to some survivors that I have talked to, they were saying, you know, Claudia, we didn't report because at the beginning it was a compliment, it maybe was a joke, maybe we didn't like it that much, but we couldn't foresee where it is leading to or where it is going to. So we didn't report at the beginning, we just said, oh, we just leave it like this, and then it continued. And there is a moment where a lot of survivors told me they didn't report because they felt jointly responsible, because they didn't stop it right away. So they felt like because they waited, they share a responsibility, and they blamed themselves a lot for not reporting. And this is something which is very common within sexual harassment. Another form I also read in surveys, and I think Kinda, maybe you can also comment on this, is that particularly national staff, who is often more closer to the communities they work with, they say, you know, we are seeing so much suffering every day on behalf of the target community, on behalf of highly vulnerable women and kids mainly. And we often feel, how can we prioritize the harm that was done to us in comparison to the huge humanitarian needs and to the harm that is often affecting the target population. So they go into this very dangerous prioritizing or saying this is more severe than this, and which is really dangerous and which needs a lot of awareness raising, because I can hear this and I see this from particularly women that work in the social sector. They feel like, oh, this joke or this misconduct is not as severe or harmful as that would often target communities are suffering from. So that's why we don't report. Back to you, Leif.
شكرا جزيلا لك كلاوديا.
Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, Claudia. Yes, we saw a lot of overlap between the problems that it happened nationally and internationally, that it's related to the fear regarding, for example, reporting of anything regarding sexual harassment. This is one of the most challenges that it faced people to report. But unfortunately, without somebody go and report, we cannot know about these things. Thank you. And because I can't see that there is any questions that is not answered, I saw that a lot of people they ask about the resources, for example, that we share in the presentation. We are going to share all the resources in the coming days that we shared in our presentations, and also including the presentation that they shared with us before we done. We are going to make a questionnaire for your opinions. I'd like to thank Claudia for her time for sharing her presentations and her opinion regarding the protections. And also I'd like to also give my thanks to Kinda. And also I'd like to thank you, all of you as audience, for sharing with us today and taking your time to come and join us in this webinar. Always we are here for any questionnaires regarding the protections, whether in Syria or after or away from the Syrian context. I like to make sure in case we have a question that is not answered. Yes, there's a questions here. Claudia, there's a questions. What are the best practices? Did you listen?
Yes, in terms of the best practical practices in tackling sexual harassment towards target communities, if I understood that correctly. The other question of Malika, I tried to answer you, but you can contact me, of course, anytime. When it comes to best practice, I must really say it's all about trust building. And when it comes to complaint or response mechanisms, and my observation is that people only talk or raise a concern, first of all, if they know their rights and if they know how humanitarian workers are supposed to behave. And second, if they trust someone. If you put a complaint box somewhere and people don't know what's going to happen with their complaint, no one is going to use it. So it's really about trust building. Best practices now are often also that, for example, safeguarding focal points or PSEA focal points, PMEAL staff is regularly present in the field. So I think this is often for us international organizations, because we are often restricted to reach certain areas because of security reasons. But I think we all need to be present physically much more often in the field than we are, and really start the conversation with beneficiaries about all these elements. But unfortunately, there is not this one solution that is going to stop it. Otherwise, we would probably all have done it. But I can say it's all about trust building and informing beneficiaries about their rights. Kinda, I can see your hand is raised.
Thank you very much, Claudia. So I want to say that some of the best practices is the internal negotiation and debates between the workers inside one organization. By this, they can figure out what is harassment, or how can they avoid it. Also, there is a necessity for each person in the organization, and that he has the responsibility to work and to move if he see anything related to harassment inside the workplace. So this is need a lot of work on awareness raising and building trust inside the employees in in one organization. Thank you very much.